what led you personally to taking this project on, and what was it like to write this book and do this research?
I myself am Mizrahi. My grandparents on one side are from Iraq. From the other side, they're Sephardic Jews from Bulgaria. I was a college student at UC Berkeley, very interested in radical politics at the time, and was an activist, and um, wrote my history paper on the American Black Panther Party, which was just founded next door in Oakland. Um, and it came across a reference to like the Israeli Black Panthers and what they were about. And I was like, that's weird. Like Mizrahi Jews need to fight against racism and for equality in Israel. Like what about my family? Like we're Israeli. So I wanted to know more, but the internet had like very, very little information.
Hello, YouTube. Please welcome our distinguished guest, journalist, and author, Asaf Elia-Shalev. Asaf is an award-winning journalist whose work has appeared in some of the most respected publications, including Haaretz, The Atlantic, Los Angeles Times, and The Guardian. With a sharp eye for storytelling and deep commitment to uncovering untold narratives, Asaf has established himself as a vital voice in journalism, particularly on issues of social justice, identity, and history. His latest 2024 book, Israel's Black Panthers, the Radicals Who Punctured a Nation's Founding Myth with the University of California Press, is a groundbreaking exploration of a little known but profoundly influential movement. The book delves into the story of Mizrahi Jewish activists in 1970s Israel who fought against systemic discrimination and inequality, drawing inspiration from the Black Panther Party in the United States. Through meticulous research and compelling prose, Asaf brings to life the struggles, triumphs, and enduring legacy of these courageous individuals. Asaf's work not only sheds light on a pivotal chapter in Israeli history, but also resonates with contemporary conversations about race, justice, and activism worldwide. But before we get into the nuts and bolts of your book, I would like to talk a little bit about why this topic deeply interests me, both academically and on a personal level. So at Emory University, we've had a very tense climate since October 7th, and I'm going to play a little video that kind of highlights what has been going on lately. Let me know if you're not able to hear this.
Now to a developing story. An Emory University medical student is fighting to get back in the classroom. The university suspended her after she spoke out in an interview following last year's protests and arrest on campus. And Channel 2 Steve Gelbach is live right now on Clifton Road in DeKalb County. Steve, supporters just rallied and held a news conference there demanding action.
A small group of students, faculty, and staff from the School of Medicine stood here with CARE, the Council on American Islamic Relations, and they demanded that Emory reinstate this grad student, saying she was just sharing her opinion when she was disciplined. Around 24 stood on a rainy morning with medical student and Palestinian American Umayma Muhammad. Emory School of Medicine suspended the doctoral student in November for 1 year for violating the university's code of conduct.
Stop the injustice against Umayma and reinstate her as a medical student.
The violation came from an interview with Democracy Now! Back in April during the protests and arrest on campus. Muhammad directed allegations that an unnamed Emory doctor volunteering with the Israeli army. There's a portion from their YouTube channel.
This man participated in aiding and abetting a genocide and aiding and abetting the destruction of the healthcare system in Gaza.
The School of Medicine found she violated the code of conduct by failing to uphold the principles of professionalism and mutual respect. The Emory's own Senate Committee on Open Expression found her speech was protected under their policy, allowing free speech and open expression of opinion.
And yet, Emory University School of Medicine's deep-seated racism has pushed it to pursue my suspension, despite being told that they are in violation of Emory policy.
Both sides are holding their ground. When asked, Muhammad said despite the culture and what she feels is a hostile environment for students like her, she would still like to return and finish her graduate work in sociology.
The reason I went to medical school is because I care about the health of our communities. So yeah, I would like to return to Emory School of Medicine.
So that's been the climate on Emory campus. They're under federal investigation for alleged Islamophobia and anti-Arab discrimination. Although that now with Donald Trump in power might all change. We don't know really what's going to happen. But last spring, the police came to campus and did what they did on April 25th. I was there that day. I was called by students who said, the police are here, the police are here, and showed up. And it's been extremely tense on campus with protests here and there and violence on many different sides. It's really largely felt unsafe, and it brought me back to 2020 when I was in Minneapolis, which is where I'm originally from, with George Floyd. And over there, I my family home, my grandma's home is not far away from where that happened. And I was involved with the protest, and I did security for the George Floyd Memorial, the square. And it was largely the Black Panther Party of Minneapolis, as well as some other street organizations like the Baldies and Antifa and these different things, who did perimeter security. And so I got to learn directly from them about how activism is done. And I used to live in Chicago, and I met Fred Hampton Jr. there briefly once. And so my life has been intertwined in different ways with the Black Panther Party. When I was a teenager, I got real interested in language and linguistics. I read Noam Chomsky, and he talks about the Black Panther Party quite a bit. And I ended up doing my bachelor's degree in linguistics. And so for me in my life, I've always been interested in the Black Panther Party. Um, there's a great academic book called Black Against Empire, also from University of California Press. And not that long ago, there was one called Freedom, the story of the Black Panther Party, that was published as well, that kind of gives a summary of the book from University of California Press. And in the Muslim community, we're aware that many of the OG Black Panthers, they're now imams and Islamic clerics. They've converted to Islam. And so I had always wondered, why? Is there some connection between, what was being taught by the Black Panther Party and Islamic ethics? And I would say a lot of Muslims would say yes. And there's books written by different people in the original Black Panther Party who are now Muslim and talk about being Muslim and also being part of the Black Panther Party. And coming to Emory, there's a professor in my department, Jeffrey Levin, who wrote this book, Our Palestine Question, Israel and American Jewish Descent. And so that's something that's been on our minds over at Emory as well. And I've always been interested in anti-colonial thought. There's this recent book from Mus'ab Yunus on the scale of the world, and it's about the formation of Black anti-colonial thought. So in the Muslim world right now, there's a lot of thinking about anti-colonial thought and Black radicalism, and all these things kind of lead me to your book, Israel's Black Panthers. And in America, the Black Power movement always had a relationship with Palestinians in that region. And so I got very curious when I found out about your book coming out and started reading it because of all those factors in my life. And when I first started reading the book, I came across this passage that really struck me. So I'm gonna read it, and then I'd love for you to talk about, what it means to be Mizrahi or what it means to be Ashkenazi in Israel during this time. And it's from the preface in page XI, or 11 in Roman numerals. Perhaps it's important to pause and spell out the meaning of black in the context of the time and place in which this book takes place. In the first few decades following the country's founding in 1948, there was almost no one in Israel who would appear racially black to American eyes. The Jews of Ethiopia had not yet arrived, nor had the non-Jewish refugees and migrants from Africa. Mizrahi Jews are typically a few shades darker than most Jews of European origin. In the Israeli context, however, they were commonly referred to as black by themselves and others for derogatory purposes. Ashkenazi Jews sometimes turned to Yiddish and called their darker skinned countrymen, and I don't speak Yiddish, but I'm going to try my best, Schwarzachaya, meaning black animal in the language of European Jewry. By picking the name they did, the young Mizrahi radicals were saying, yes, we are in fact black animals. We're the Black Panthers. And I just found that really striking and how it explains the differences in Jewish race relations. But would you be willing to talk more about that?
Yeah, of course. Thank you for having me on. Um, so the people who founded Israel explicitly envisioned creating a European country for the Jews in the Middle East. And they focused on the Ashkenazi Jews, that is, Jews from Central and Eastern Europe. And the country, this new state was meant to solve the problem they had in Europe with anti-Semitism. The problem was that they needed more Jews in order to populate this country, to um, settle the frontiers, to serve in the military, to work in the factories, and to provide a demographic counterweight to the Palestinians, and especially the Palestinians. And so that's when this new Israeli state starts to bring in Jews from the million or so Jews that live all over the Middle East. They were not considered Mizrahi at the time. There's no singular identity for all these Jews. Um, they came from countries that were really diverse: Morocco, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, um, and and more. And they're not all Arab either. Like some came from Iran or India, and they come to Israel. And the view that the ruling class has of these Jews from Middle Eastern countries is the same view that the average European had. It was a racist idea about there being superior races and inferior races. And so the people who founded the country viewed these Jews as belonging, as either belonging to inferior races, or having or they might have said that they were degraded, their human quality was diminished by exposure over many generations to Muslims and Arabs and other groups. But they bring him over, and they're kind of ambivalent about that. But it happens. And there is a whole set of policies that create a regime of discrimination that give these newcomers from Middle Eastern countries less access to resources, poor jobs, poor housing, um, poor education. And through that experience, they're racialized into a new category that we call Mizrahi. They called Mizrahi, and then later, it's kind of reclaimed as a positive. But it literally in Hebrew it means Eastern, but it's kind of a geographic misnomer because Morocco, for example, where many Mizrahim come from, is far to the west of Eastern Europe, where Ashkenazim come from. So, but yeah, you have this tiered society with white Jews on top and brown Jews below them. And Israel at this time was really insistent on being a European country and presented itself to the world as a white country. And so the Mizrahim were both an important asset because they represented the majority of Jews in Israel, but they were a liability because of their Arabness, or not just Arabness, but their Mizrahiness.
So forgive my ignorance, and also just for the viewers out there who might not know, um, what's the difference between this term Mizrahim or Sephardims or Sephardic? Because we hear Sephardic a lot in the academy, but Mizrahim, we don't hear that term used hardly ever.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's very good. It's very important to clarify that. So, um, traditionally, in a lot of places, people still talk about Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews. It's just not a good enough classification system. Sephardic Jews means refers to Jews who were expelled from Spain and Portugal from the Iberian Peninsula after 1492. There was a mass expulsion, and Sephardic means Spanish in Hebrew. There was a mass expulsion, and those Jews 500 years ago were dispersed um, around the Mediterranean basin primarily. So that's North Africa, Turkey, a lot of where the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire welcomed these Jews, so they ended up settling in a lot of those lands. So Sephardic refers to Jews who were the product of this expulsion, right? But all the countries where they go to, these lands where they go to, there were already Jews there. So those Jews, it would make sense to call them Sephardic. They were never expelled from Spain. And Iranian Jews, for example, like doesn't really make sense to call them Sephardic. Uh, the reason the term continued to exist is that Sephardic Jews kind of maintain distinct liturgical and religious practices, and there were like kind of two main recognized Jewish religious traditions, the Sephardic tradition and the Ashkenazi tradition. But Yemenite Jews were doing their own thing, Ethiopian Jews were doing their own thing, like so we can't really all group them as Sephardic. Then the term Mizrahi emerges after Israel's founded after 1948. I mean, it's got some echoes before then, um, with terms such as communities of the East, but um, it was born out of not out of it was born out of an ingathering of people from all these different cultures and having a common experience in Israel. Uh, this term came to describe them, Mizrahim. So um, many Mizrahim are Sephardic, but not all of them. And not all Sephardic people are Mizrahi because Mizrahi really is an Israeli term. And so if you're a Sephardic Jew living in Seattle, there's a Sephardic community there, your experience really has nothing to do with Mizrahiness, which is a very Israeli experience. Although some people in the States are now adopting Mizrahiness out of like solidarity, which I have no objection to, but that kind of explains the difference. I mean,
And then, I was blessed that I got a scholarship to do my master's at the University of Chicago in religious studies with a focus on Islam. And one of the professors I met there, I got to shadow her classes, was Urit Bashkin, and she specializes in Arab Jews, the Arab Jews of Iraq. And we have the scholarship now of Avi Shlaim and this kind of new generation of scholarship. And they talk about Arab Jews or Mizrahi community and these types of things, and it's like a new kind of cutting edge area of research. But for those out there who are unaware, if you're a Arab Jew, what does that mean? Does that mean your family were Arabs who converted to Judaism, or are you ethnically Jewish but living in Arab lands? Like there's, I think, some confusion amongst people outside the community about that. Could you clarify?
yeah, I mean, I don't really use the term Arab Jews very often, definitely not in the way you're using it. Um, Arab Jews is like this term that came into fashion um, on the left to say that Jews that came from Iraq or Egypt or all these Arab countries, they were like Arabs, but Jews, just like there are Arab Christians and Arab Muslims, and like theoretically that makes sense, except for there's almost no one who identifies as an Arab Jew. Like there are some people, but almost none of them do. They you know Mizrahim don't see themselves as Arabs in any way. Um, they they'll say that their family, their community maintained distinct a distinct identity while they were in the Arab countries. That's also not entirely right. Like the whole concept of Arabness kind of coalesced And at one point in the early 20th century, like Jews could have and did belong to Arabness. Right? The Middle East was full of was very heterogeneous in that era. Um, and there was this pan-Arab idea that like wanted to include all the different minority groups in this one identity. Um, so I think when people say Arab Jews today, what they're trying to make a political point that Jews who kind of came from Arab countries and speak Arabic, or at least their parents or grandparents spoke Arabic, and they share that culture, they want to include them in Arabness, and that is kind of meant to undermine this binary between Jew and Arab, and undermine Zionism. Really, that's kind of the goal of using the term, um, because uh, Zionism kind of yanked Jews out of. Well, they were both expelled and they were both pulled and pushed. Uh, it's kind of complicated to explain how and why the Jews left Arab countries and came to Israel, but um, people who see the Israeli project as wrong, and the Zionist project as unjust, want to kind of undo it with this term. And you know, I don't think they've been very successful, but that's the idea.
And so the passage that I had read a little bit ago, which kind of said, okay, the Mizrahim are like reclaiming this term black for the Black Panther Party in Israel. Does that kind of implies then that someone else was considered white? Can you
Yeah.
talk about that?
Yeah. I mean, if Ashkenazi Jews are calling, this does not happen today. No one uses the term Schwarze Chaya, but if in the 50s and the 60s, um, Ashkenazi Jews were calling Mizrahi Jews in Israel Schwarze Chaya in Yiddish, which means black animal. Yes, of course, they were implying that they were white. And, um, and that was the contention of a lot of people. That was a response to anti-Semitism of Europe. It's one of the responses to anti-Semitism in Europe, right? The Nazis and the anti-Semites said that like the Jews are an other. Um, they're not the same race as us, um, and some Jews responded to that by saying, no, that's a mistake. We belong among the superior races of the world. They're just we are white. You just aren't. You're mistakenly classifying us as beneath, rather than saying that the whole hierarchy of races is wrong on its own. But yeah, there was this sense of whiteness, and there is a sense of whiteness, and although now it's different. Now Israel's kind of very proud of its multiculturalism, and there's a lot of people nowadays that are insisting that Jews are not white, and um, a lot to unpack there.
So, what was the experience of Jews who immigrated to Israel from places like Morocco or Yemen or Iraq or these types of places? In your book, I remember reading that as soon as they got off the boat, they would get like sprayed with DDT or something.
Yeah. That a lot of people recalled that when I talked to them coming in, like as if they were diseased. Israel's founding prime minister, David Ben-Gurion, he said that Mizrahim are dirty, unmannered, prone to thievery, and prone to rape. Right? This is what the founding father says. Um, uh, a correspondent for Haaretz newspaper, which I used to work at, but he went out in like around 1949 to go meet the wave of Mizrahi Jews that are about to arrive, and he was horrified at what he saw. He described them as dirty Africans, and he had a lot of this kind of super racist language, which was really shocking um, for me to hear, because this was only a few years after the Holocaust, where Nazis were deploying that kind of language against Jews to justify um, their extermination. And in any case, so now that you have this rhetoric that's in circulation, and these perceptions about the Mizrahim that are arriving, and if they are indeed so dangerous, if they're prone to crime and they have diseases, you're pretty well justified taking steps to neutralize a threat or to mitigate that threat. And so, as in response to that, now you there's a whole set of policies that are enacted to marginalize Mizrahim. They are settled on the periphery of the country in these tiny little tent encampments, or tin shack communities, and prevented from living in the center of the country. Many of them, where there's economic opportunity, they're tracked to vocational school instead of academic learning, because Israel's whole education system was founded on the idea that Ashkenazim have superior cognitive abilities, that Mizrahim had become, to put it plainly, like dumb, because they'd spent a lot of time among Muslims who, according to that ideology, are not capable of abstract thinking, for example. So we need to it was talked about as like a generous and positive thing. We need to rehabilitate the Mizrahi Jew through an education that just so happens to put them at an inferior position socioeconomically. And so there was this like Mizrahi masses were like became impoverished in Israel, when they weren't necessarily impoverished in their countries of origin. And they also were told that everything that they brought with them, all the cultural identity they brought with them, was bad and wrong and shameful, because it was of the enemy. The Arabs are the enemy, and why are you speaking Arabic? Why are you listening to Kulthum or Abdel Wahab or Farid al-Atrash? And like those things needed to be shed and erased. And it's true. People often point out that like Israel's also tried to erase Yiddish, and was trying to mold all Jews into like this new Israeli identity, which is true, but it's not the same when the Ashkenazi Jew comes to kind of dominate what the new identity is, and the letting go of Yiddish because it's seen as the diasporic vestige is different than the self-hate people are kind of internalizing because their grandparents and parents speak Arabic at home and like are share an identity with the enemy.
And so I can imagine after the huge, like traumatic experience of the Holocaust and a feeling of humiliation, there's a desire to feel then, you know, I'm proud of myself in some sort of way. And so an identity gets created, but it can be problematic when it gets pushed in ways that are not healthy, right?
Yeah,
You had
yeah.
mentioned,
The early Zionists had a kind of an odd view of the Holocaust. It's not really something we talk about today, but they thought that the Jews who were killed in the Holocaust were passive, were like sheep's getting ready to be slaughtered,
mm,
and they kind of looked down upon them. But living in the diaspora had made them weak and subservient, and that yeah, in Israel now we're going to be militant and strong, and um, yeah. So instead of like, when in fact we know that Jews, of course, resisted the Holocaust, and we talk about, we don't focus on their being, we don't say that Holocaust victims were meek anymore. That's not a thing that would be appropriate to say nowadays, but it's kind of how they're talked about at the time.
would you say the current Likud party is very inspired by that militancy from the past? Is that
Yeah,
fair?
sure. It was, yeah, of course. Of course.
So you had mentioned that the Mizrahim, they got pushed away from the economic centers. So what kind of neighborhoods or places did they end up living?
Yeah, so places like Dimona and Kiryat Shmone and Ashkelon, and anywhere that kind of is on the border with at the time Jordan and Egypt and Syria and Lebanon. So they were, not only were they far away from the jobs and the economic hub of Tel Aviv, they were also subject to whenever there was military confrontations, they were kind of on the front lines.
So they were used almost like a buffer zone.
Yeah, I mean, the idea was that this new state is established, but that its borders aren't really well established or set, and that its existence is precarious. And the theory was that, in order to secure the country, we must occupy it. We must spread out and live there. And so the problem was when they tried to get Ashkenazim to like move to the periphery and establish communities there, like they weren't willing to do it. Most were just not interested in that. So that's why it became the policy to settle Mizrahim there. And there was this racist idea that Mizrahim were like simple people. Maybe they lived in caves, which is the stereotype, the cave dwellers, the stereotype that comes up again and again from that period. The idea is like they don't need much. They're not very sophisticated. So it's appropriate to put them in like a tent encampment in the desert. Of course, European Jews are suited for city life, and they need more than that. That was how it was talked about at the time.
Martin Luther King, he was famous for saying, "How can you tell me to pull myself up by my bootstraps when I ain't got no boot?" And it sounds like they were also given no boot to begin with.
Yeah.
And then your
and
book,
what's
go ahead.
yeah, and I'll take it a step further. They the Israeli government was like talking a big game about Mizrahim being like, I mean, the Mizrahim came from cities like Casablanca and Istanbul and Baghdad. These were real cities. Like Tel Aviv was not a real city at the time. Tel Aviv was like a small little thing. And so the Mizrahim, many of them were like far more cosmopolitan um, than the residents of this new country.
You had mentioned in your book also that these neighborhoods were subject to more policing, incarceration, there was literacy issues. Seemed like there was also some sort of prison, like school to prison pipeline kind of thing, or people doing probation in the kibbutzim. I'm wondering if you can talk about what the climate was like.
Yeah, so remember I said that when they brought the Mizrahim over, they said they were prone to criminality. So, if you look at history, that there weren't in Morocco, the jails weren't full of Jews. Like there weren't a lot of Jewish criminals. Like that wasn't a thing. Of course, there might have been some, but like there wasn't. Morocco didn't have a problem of Jews being criminals. But when they come to Israel, Moroccans in particular come to like fill the prisons. They all are like become criminals. Like so, it kind of becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy through kind of this forced poverty and forced marginalization. That gives rise to criminality. Um, and yeah, and without absent opportunity, a lot of young people get into trouble and end up in this, school to prison pipeline that you're talking about, if there was even a school for them to go to.
And so, in this context, the Black Panther Party got started. Is that correct?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, do you want me to say more about how they got started or like there's a lot more context I could
Yeah,
get into.
please tell.
So there's this one, there's this one wave of families from Morocco uh, that arrive in the late 40s, early 50s, and they refused to go along with the program of being settled in the frontier in the middle of nowhere, and they head to Jerusalem. They've been praying to Jerusalem per Jewish tradition since time immemorial. And they said, well, we're here in the Holy Land, of course, in Israel, we're going to go to Jerusalem, but there isn't housing for them there. What they do find is that Jerusalem is split into East Jerusalem, which is controlled by Jordan, that's where the Palestinians live, and West Jerusalem, which is controlled by Israel, where the Jews live. And in between, there's a no man's land, which is kind of these neighborhoods that were depopulated, that Palestinians had fled in the 1948 war, and now we're kind of these bombed out, empty homes, quite beautiful homes, but like in very bad shape. And this zone, it was a buffer between the two countries, and it didn't belong to anyone. And this wave of Moroccan Jews comes flowing in and settles in these homes that, again, used to belong to Palestinians. And there's barbed wire everywhere. There's soldiers overhead in the buildings on both sides. It's dangerous. There's no government services. There's sewage running through the street. It's very, very crowded. And uh, and you have like the young men of the community are just kind of loitering on the street. They there's no employment for them. They hardly speak Hebrew. They don't know, many don't know how to read and write. And things could have gone on this way, but then 1967 happens, the Six-Day War, and everything changes like that. Overnight, Israel kind of expands its borders and unifies Jerusalem into one city. Gone is the no man's land, the barbed wire, the snipers, and this neighborhood, these neighborhoods that were in between, one particular neighborhood, Musrara, was now it was the dangerous backwaters of Israel. Now it is at the very center of a very exciting city, a very dynamic city. People from all over Israel are rushing to Jerusalem to be able to access the holy sites uh, that were locked up behind the enemy border in Jordan. They want to see the Wailing Wall. They want to see the Mount of Olives and all the different sites. Um, Also internationally, people start arriving in very large numbers to come see the holy sites, to come see this young country that had defeated all the Arab armies in this miracle. Like they want to see what that's all about. And a lot of what was happening in the world, I mean, think of the 1960s, hadn't arrived in Israel yet. The counterculture, the hippies, the kind of the political revolutionaries of the world, rock and roll, the drug culture, sexual liberation, those hadn't arrived. But after 67, they come rushing in through visitors, through music being brought in, magazines, anecdotes from people who visited abroad. The people who are best positioned, who take most advantage of this influx of culture, are a group of young Mizrahi men from the neighborhood of Musrara, right in the center of Jerusalem. They are super into Jimi Hendrix and rock and roll. They love the drugs. They love uh, they love the sexual encounters they're getting, right, because the girls in their neighborhood were not interested in them at all. But all these foreign women are coming in, and they're like, oh, there's instant attraction between the local Mizrahim and the foreign visitors. Uh, they're taken. They love the whole aesthetic that's coming from the West, the rebelliousness of it. Um, and there was another. So in any case, yeah, they start wearing their hair long, and they start to realize that there are a lot of young people like them around the world who are kind of alienated and marginalized. And they realize it's not just that my life is fucked up, or you can bleep that out. My life is, in shambles. It's also my whole community looks a certain way. And why is that? And they start to like wise up to like the systemic issues at play and the racism. And they're inspired by all these different revolutionary movements um, that are happening in Europe and the United States, but also South America and East Asia. And the Panthers are kind of the most compelling voice and aesthetic for them. It's limited what they actually know about the Panthers because it's all coming in through translation. There's no internet. There's just these stories, maybe images, um, maybe some literature from the Panthers that is coming in. They What they're mostly hearing about the Panthers, though, might be coming from the Israeli press, which is like had this preoccupation with the Panthers in those days. And the Israeli media describes the Black Panther Party of Oakland as being anti-Semitic because they supported the Palestinian cause. So that made them anti-Semitic to the Israeli press. And most Israelis would have thought of the Panthers as like this dangerous enemy, as this thing that we need to fight against. For these young men in Musrara, the message was a little bit different. What their takeaway was that this is a group that the establishment is scared of, and that made them only more appealing. And so they kind of kick around the idea of like, hey, what if we became like the Panthers? And that notion, that conversation kind of is leaked to the press. And from there, it causes a massive reaction. And the Panthers learn from that reaction, in terms of that attention they get from politicians, from the press, from police, from the general public, that they're really onto something. And that like galvanizes them to like actually organize into a political movement.
So when people heard there's a Black Panther Party within Israel, did they automatically think that this is maybe a anti-Semitic or pro-Palestinian type of cause, or did they see it as something different?
So it very from the beginning, it was clear that like this was a movement of Mizrahi Jews who, are like sick of living in poverty and sick of like the conditions of their lives. And the main reaction to the name is like, oh, well, you may have a point, but like about the inequality, but why use such a name? People were like kind of scandalized by this choice of the name of Black Panthers. And what the Panthers themselves said to that very, very quickly, the retort was, well, when our parents call themselves like the Association of Jews from North Africa, no one paid any attention. It's only when we called ourselves the Panthers, this name you hate so much that like you started to listen. So we're gonna stick to this name. Thank you very much.
And how did the Israeli government at the time respond to them?
Yeah.
Was it
So from
repression?
the police immediately uh, planted informants in the group from like day one. Um, Politicians tried to like pretend they don't exist at first, and then they said stuff like, this is an inappropriate import of American, issues to Israel. Like this doesn't fit here. This doesn't make sense to like impose American racial binaries in Israel. Blah blah blah. Um, And then the Panthers started to like actually organize and said, "Hey, we're gonna hold a mass protest in Jerusalem, and it's gonna be against police brutality and against discrimination and so forth." And then the reaction was kind of insane. The police, who had already infiltrated the group, were like, "Well, they're planning a protest and they're asking for a permit, but what do we do?" And they take it to their commander, and then the commander takes it to the minister of police, and the minister of police also doesn't know what to do, and he involves the prime minister of Israel. Right? These are like street hooligans who had a third grade education, who no one thought would ever amount to anything. They hadn't done anything yet, and now the prime minister of the country calls an emergency meeting with their top aides to discuss what to do about the request to have a protest, like a political demonstration.
And legally with a permit, it sounds like.
Yeah, they wanted a permit. So what, like, and Israel, like, had laws that, like, were supposed to protect, free speech and stuff, at least for some people. And though Israel didn't and still doesn't have a constitution, so the status of these protections has always been kind of iffy. Uh, but they're like, do we give them the permit, let them demonstrate? Isn't that going to like legitimize their claims, which we want to suppress? I'm kind of describing the conversation they're having at this emergency meeting that's based on minutes that were kept by the government. And so they're debating, okay, do we let or do we or maybe we should prevent the protest from happening. But how do we do that? Like, if we don't give them a permit, they're probably going to demonstrate anyway. So like, what do we arrest them? But like, they haven't committed a crime. So like, what charge do we arrest them on? Like, and they're like, oh, I guess we could like apply laws from before Israel was a state, when it was under the British mandate. There were like sort of emergency laws we could turn to. Um, but like, what should we do? And the prime minister ultimately makes the call of what to do. And I don't want to say what she decides, because that's kind of the cliffhanger that I opened the book with, this dilemma of like how to respond. Um, but it's very clear that the establishment sees them as a massive threat,
Why?
when literally it's just a group of friends with an idea. It's not even, I mean, they're not even like Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, who start the Panthers with already having undergone a political education. Uh, you know, they're forming, the Panthers got started in a very deliberate way in the States, and were very, very organized, very ideological from the beginning. There were also guns involved, right? So like there was that made it
Police shootings
threatening.
early on.
Yeah, yeah, they would, right. They have gun. They follow around the cops who are like stopping black people to make sure that try to protect black lives from police brutality. Um, and the Panthers are like literally just a group of friends who like had never read Marx, had never read, you know, revolutionary literature. They maybe had started hearing stuff. They maybe started like engaging with radicalism, but that's about it. And now the government's like has this whole reaction all the way up to the prime minister.
And did the Black Panther Party there in Israel ever realize they had been infiltrated by the police or government? And if they did, what did they do?
Yeah, I mean, they realized very quickly, because the police kept trying to like poach them and offer them jobs, and sometimes like Panthers even accepted the jobs, and like I'm not going to inform, or like give me the stuff. Like they've been living in poverty their whole lives. Now people are offering them jobs. Like they were not so dumb. They realized what was going on. Um, and they reacted like, there was some attempt at security culture, but like they tried to like they kind of trusted that they could outsmart the police, and that as long as they kept the important decisions to them amongst themselves, this core group, that it's okay. Um, yeah.
And so, what kind of activism had they been doing in the community? They had stolen some milk and different stuff. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, there were different, like, so the activism in the community involved, they did stuff like tutoring, neighborhood cleanups, and yeah, and so one of their, this is a stunt, because it was like they did it once and it was meant to grab headlines, and it did grab headlines, but Operation Milk is what they called it, where they raided the rich neighborhood in Jerusalem early one morning, and stole the milk bottles that were delivered to people's homes. So if you were rich, you got milk delivered. That's how you got milk in those days. You got it delivered to your house. Like poor people couldn't afford milk. And so they go and they stole all of it, and they left a note behind saying, "Thank you so much for your donation to the Panthers. This is going to go a long way towards helping needy families, and we're so sorry that your cats won't have milk to drink today, but thank you." And then they take the milk bottles and travel across town to one of the poor neighborhoods, and distribute it in front of people's doors. And that's like this obscene luxury. People will wake up and there's milk, and they're like, what's going on? Like, this is a dream. And there's a line, and then they leave a note there as well. They say, hey, this is courtesy of the Panthers. But if you want to be able to drink milk every day, then you have to join our cause, and join the war on poverty, and join the Panthers. That's the only way you'll be able to access this on a regular basis.
And because they had lived usually in close proximity to Arab borders, they had some interactions with Arab neighbors. Would you be willing to talk about that?
Yeah, so the the Panthers grew up right in the no man's land. There was just almost no separation between them and the Palestinians of East Jerusalem. And so from when they were kids, like they got to know their Palestinian peers, if only even through looking each other in the eyes, kids flying a kite over the fence, or just these sometimes even snuck across and played together. And there was this like familiarity and even a curiosity about like who's just right there. And then after the kind of the border went away, Mizrahim like immediately found that they had a lot in common with the Palestinians. They shared a culture. They spoke different dialects of Arabic, but it was pretty easy for them to like start communicating. Hashish was a very important element of this because hashish was very common in East Jerusalem with the Palestinians. It's easy to get there, but the Ashkenazi Jews who had the money to pay for it were like scared of the Arabs. So they went to the Mizrahim. It was like, hey, can you hook us up with hashish? And they're like, no big deal. I'm not scared of the Palestinians. I'm just gonna go and get you some hashish. And so there's like this triangle trade that's developed, and that actually forms, it's not just commerce, it's like real relationships come out of that, where people are getting high together. Um, and there's a shared life between Mizrahi Jews and Palestinians after 67 and through much of the 70s, maybe even into the 80s. There's relationships, there's business ventures, joint business ventures, there's friendships, and just everyday life. Today we call that coexistence, and at the time it was just like normal life for many residents in Jerusalem.
Did the Israeli Black Panthers ever develop kind of a ideological response to the project of Zionism, or how did they perceive the situation with Israel and the Palestinians?
The answer to those is different.
Okay.
So the Panthers definitely did not see themselves at the time as anti-Zionists. Their whole point was like insisting on having an equal place in this new Jewish state, right? The Mizrahim were invited as Jews to like be partners in the creation of the state, but then when they come, they're like marginalized and abused. And I was like, why would you treat us this way? And here the Panthers come is like, no, like, you know, we have a lot to be proud of. We belong here. We're gonna take our rightful place. Later, some Panthers become anti-Zionist because they kind of their analysis takes them in that direction, but that takes many years. For some it takes there's a variation. Some also become right wingers, so there's a whole set of responses. In any case, they are a left-wing group in the sense that they're whatever they thought about Zionism or about Israel, that led them to or that didn't preclude them from being very radical on the Palestinian issue and on the conflict. So you have to remember in 1971, when the Panthers kind of their heyday and the whole 70s, no one in Israel believed in a two-state solution, except for a tiny, tiny handful, like a few dozen people. Everyone thinks that Palestinians are simply like terrorists and that they have no right to self-determination because they're not a real people, not a real nation, and that we just need to fight them and win. The Panthers are some of the very first Israelis that call to establish a Palestinian state alongside Israel. Very radical for its day, and they saw Palestinian claims as like basically legitimate. The very first Israelis to meet with Yasser Arafat, the head of the Palestine Liberation Organization, the kind of the leader of Palestinian nationalism, is a Black Panther. Charlie Beaton is his name. So the Panthers are way ahead of their time. after Charlie Bita meets with Yasser Arafat, a law is passed to criminalize that. Like, so Israelis are no longer allowed to meet with Arafat or anyone from his faction. Uh, and so they're really kind of, they describe Mizrahim as a bridge to the Middle East, as like we, if you just let us, we will be able to bridge the divide between, Israel and its neighbors. Like we have the assets, we have the cultural capital in order to make this happen. That's the kind of the case they make.
And so, what was the Black Panther Party's relationship to religion and the Passover, Pesach, and these types of things when they also simultaneously hold the views you just talked about?
Uh, so the Panthers came from religiously observant homes, like most Mizrahim, but they embraced kind of a very secular identity, right? The political radicalism that was coming into Israel that they kind of wanted to participate in was secular, right? It had Marxist roots, um and so they saw no need really for the religion of their parents. The way they saw it, like the way they talked about it, the way they understood is that when their parents arrived in Israel and were mistreated, instead of resisting that, though they did resist, but the Panthers weren't aware or didn't or kind of discounted that resistance. In any case, the way they saw it is that their parents said, "Oh, it's all from God. If I have to live in the shithole, if I don't have any money to feed my kids, it's all from God. I just have to put my head down and accept it." And the Panthers are like, "Accept it? No way! Like, what use do I have for God if the poverty I'm experiencing is from Him? Like, if I just have to accept my lot in life, no way." So they became secular, but they were fluent in all the religious stuff. And so when in 1971, when Passover came around, Passover is the holiday of liberation from slavery, from captivity by Pharaoh in ancient Egypt. Um, they're like, well, let's kind of use the holiday to make our point. And Jews read the Haggadah on Passover. It's like the story of the Exodus from Egypt, the liberation from Egypt, where Moses leads the Israelites through the desert to the promised land. And they're like, well, we'll write our own version of the Haggadah. The Israeli Prime Minister, Golda Meir, she's going to be Pharaoh, and we're going to be kind of the liberators. And they, kind of they adapt the story to like their circumstances. And in many ways, it serves as kind of a sequel to the original Haggadah. If the Haggadah was, here's our exodus, our escape from Egypt, and our travel to the Holy Land, the Panther Haggadah says, well, what happens when the Jews arrive in the Holy Land? They're like, the Mizrahim arrived in this land, and what they found was further alienation and further slavery. So now it's time to fight for liberation once again.
So they're saying like we need a new exodus against oppression, right?
Yeah, yeah,
That's
yeah,
really cool.
yeah.
And how did the Black Panther Party in Israel influence Israeli politics? Like what other groups did they work with or against or
So they were part of, in one sense, they were part of like kind of the fringe far left in Israel because of their association with the Panther kind of brand, and because of their position on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Um, so groups like Matzpen were allied with them. Anti-Zionist faction was very small. They actually like try to run for office, and they capture like seats on the National Labor Federation board, which is like a very important body in Israel at the time. But then right when like elections for the national parliament are going to happen, the Yom Kippur War breaks out. That's 1973. And so the election gets postponed until after the war, and then at that point, like no one wants to hear about the Panthers anymore. People are just like just worried about the foreign threat, the threat of war. It felt like Israel was going to lose the war. So there's this emphasis on national security and unity. And the Panthers kind of fade away as a movement after that. But they left a mark in that they kind of liberated the your questions are good, by the way. They liberated the Mizrahim and allowed them to kind of rebel against the old guard and rebel against kind of the establishment. And they unleashed this like this new courage and this new energy, and that ultimately helps lead to the downfall of like the establishment party. So to give you a little bit of context, Israel is founded and led until this point by the labor movement of Israel, labor Zionism, um, which kind of identify with socialism and all that. And the right wing version of Zionism is kind of in the minority and it's suppressed. But once there's all this upheaval following the Panthers and the war and the panic over Israel's future, like the uh, the politician was best able to capitalize on the energy of that period and capture the imagination of the Mizrahi public. Is Menachem Begin, the founder of the Likud party, the same party that Netanyahu represents today. And he says to them, well, forget the old guard. Don't vote for them. Vote for me. I will put you at the center of this country. It was never right to begin with that you were marginalized. You're the real Jews. You're the true kind of heroes of the country. He emphasizes he plays to their Jewish pride because Mizrahim, like I mentioned, were traditionally observant, and he plays to that. The labor movement, they were very secular. They would not have worn like a kippah, yarmulke in public. Menachem Begin is very glad to do that. He knows how to deploy those symbols very effectively. And he also kind of sells them on hyper-nationalism, right? Mizrahim come to Israel and their Arabness is like a shameful thing to get rid of, but that leads to self-hate. And like, how do you prove that you belong to this country, to this Jewish country? You emphasize your anti-Arabness. That is seen as like a ticket to belonging. And they find that ticket in Menachem Begin. So ironically, like this left-wing movement helps lead to the rise of right-wing politics in Israel. And to this day, you have members of the Likud who speak with nostalgia about the Panthers. You'd never find Republicans talking about with nostalgia about the Black Panther Party of Oakland. Like that would be weird. So that's what you have in Israel. And the reason for that is the Panthers really represented an authentic movement of Mizrahim. And so you try to co-opt that by, to this day, the Likud talks about the elites and the rebelling against the elite and against the establishment, even though they've been in power for like 50 years, for like 40 years, like they still claim that like the Ashkenazim of the labor movement are in charge of things. They like to pretend that. And so they keep calling up, summoning the Panthers as a symbol to represent their like rebellion. But of course, it's like it's silly. It's like silly to be in power and call other people the elite. We see this in the United States too.
And so this question is going to be kind of a big and open-ended question, but I'm very curious how you'd answer it. And that is, how did the Israeli Black Panther Party puncture a nation's founding myth?
Yeah, so Israel was founded on a few myths but importantly that Jews were that this was like a Jewish state where Jews could come and find safety and brotherhood. And yet by 1971, like there were two types of Jews. Like there were the haves and the haves not. The Ashkenazim and the Mizrahim, and Israel kind of refused to acknowledge it had a problem, and it was like just ignoring it and suppressing it, pretending it. And the Panthers punctured that, and they forced a reckoning over that. They forced Israel to acknowledge that this notion of Jewish brotherhood and safety like just wasn't real for most Jews. And that triggered like many changes to Israeli society and Israeli law.
And then this will be the last question, also a big one. But what led you personally to taking this project on, and what was it like to write this book and do this research?
It's usually one of the first things I talk about when I talk about the book. But I myself am Mizrahi. My grandparents on one side are from Iraq. From the other side, they're Sephardic Jews from Bulgaria. I was a college student at UC Berkeley, very interested in radical politics at the time, and was an activist, and wrote my history paper on the American Black Panther Party, which was just founded next door in Oakland. And he came across a reference to like the Israeli Black Panthers and what they were about. And I was like, that's weird. Like Mizrahi Jews need to fight against racism and for equality in Israel. Like what about my family? Like we're Israeli. So I wanted to know more, but the internet had like very little information. I found it very frustrating. And I went about like trying to learn more and talking to my family and reading, whatever academic papers I could find. And then like as I stopped being an activist and became a journalist, I fell in love with narrative nonfiction, with this genre where we tell factual stories, but in a novelistic way with characters and dialogue and plot and scenes and all of that. And eventually I decided that I'm going to fix this kind of shameful hole in the public record and tell the story of the Panthers using this genre of writing. And and that meant interviewing every person I could find who's connected to the story, collecting every news article that had ever been written. Almost probably 99% of news articles that have ever been written about the Panthers, that talking thousands of articles from dozens of publications. I've hitting the archives, finding classified police files from the time, and stitching all of that together into a story, like pulling out the pertinent details, doing research on what the weather was like that day in order to like help explain, why the protest went in this direction instead of that direction. All these kind of things to like animate the era, researching, the architectural trends of the day, fashion, every aspect I could find. And it took me years and years and years. Like I had kids in the middle. I moved countries twice. I got married. I had to make a living because like there's no money in book writing, for at least not this kind of book writing. So it was like very hard, but I'm glad it's finally done.
Did you have unexpected challenges or big like kind of research issues that were hard to figure out?
Yeah, what comes to mind first, I think, is that a real big challenge is that many of the Panthers I found, like almost all of them basically, had come from like pretty difficult backgrounds. Like they grew, childhood malnutrition was big, incarceration, drug abuse. There's a lot of trauma, and their memories were like, as you'd expect, they were meandering, they were abstract, they were not chronological, they lacked a lot of specificity. There were a lot of like kind of collective memories that had taken on, like people said things that like they felt they participated in because that was like the collective, but they actually weren't there. And so that's pretty tricky journalistically. Um, Whereas like the Mizrahim, whereas Ashkenazi kind of allies who came from pretty privileged backgrounds and were there and they tended to remember everything pretty clearly and chronologically, and they had documents to back up like the things they were saying. And so it was a huge challenge for me how to not privilege these sources that were like much more, useful than people were like talking in vague kind of meandering ways, and how to, like it's really important not to overly center the Ashkenazi voices in a story like this. So um that was a huge challenge, and like I did my best. I wish I could do more.
Sounds like you were trying to balance the oral history and textual history, and then the textual history having the added fact that it's usually Ashkenazi. So
Yeah,
it's a
yeah.
conundrum, but I think you did it
But
really
even the
excellent.
oral history, right? The Ashkenazim could like relate it in a way more, it's so much easier to follow what was going on, and to fact check what they were saying than many of the Panthers. But yes.
Well, it was a pleasure having you here. I really, really enjoyed learning more about your book and this topic. Yeah, this was awesome. So thank you very much for being here, and I think we'll end it here. Do you have any
Yeah.
final comments or anything you'd like to say?
No, no, thank you so much. I really appreciated the questions, and I learned a lot from your questions, like thinking through this stuff. I'm glad to and glad to keep the conversation going. If any of your viewers want to reach out, please do.
I'm in the days staring at my lifeline, thinking about all the dark in the night times, when the youngin' never had it in his right mind, like a shadow that never let the light shine. But it runs so deep, you might find your mind's eye asleep, your sight blind, unravel, looking at the man apart, how you got yourself wrapped in a tight bind. Rewind, baby boy took his first breath. A little later, baby boy took his first steps. After that, little man got his first gun. 2 shots, now he bleeding with the burst lung. Begging the Lord, please, don't let that hearse come. Another day in my life is like the worst one. I never knew it so hard, like the back of a slave. I'm not ready to go till my work's done. Pay attention, he never meant to hurt them. Cocaine and the flame, how we burnt them. Another day, another dollar, how they murk son. Now make his daughter walk the strip, it's worth something. I'm in the days, staring at my lifeline, thinking about all the dark in the night times, when the youngin' never had it in his right mind, like a shadow that never let the light shine. But it runs so deep, you might find your mind's eye asleep, your sight blind, unraveled, looking at the man apart, how you got yourself wrapped in the tight bind. Rewind, I'm sitting in my jail cell, I'm looking at the signs, they was telltale. I'm putting down the rhymes like I'm Melly Mel. I know the game real good, very well. Aim straight when you burn with the hell rail. Cause most niggas scary, they very frail. This is not another story, a fairy tale. It can get real gory, a burial. This is not for wholesale or resale. Taking niggas out the game like I'm sickle cell. And it's all fucked up, coronavirus. One snort of that dope, a clear your sinus. Like you plus me equal a minus. Kinda like all of the stars, not in alignment. Kinda like real niggas stuck in confinement. And we struggle to reach enlightenment. I'm in the days, staring at my lifeline, thinking about all the dark in the night times, when the youngin' never had it in his right mind, like a shadow that never let the light shine. But it runs so deep, you might find your mind's eye asleep, your sight blind, unraveled, looking at the man apart, how you got yourself wrapped in a tight bind. Fast forward, he was pulling up in Range Rovers. Now his luck running out, 4-leaf clovers. I was seeing Big Ben, cup running over. Now it's Ho Chi Minh, Vietnam soldiers. Like that boy on fire, to the wire. Like, why take the stand? Why take the wire?
Been working. Somebody been working, yo.
Yeah. Thank y'all.
Talk your shit, man. Nah, talk your